Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says U.S. President Donald Trump largely shares European positions on Ukraine. Europe's most prominent politicians presented a united front in Berlin, backing Ukraine ahead of the Friday Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska that may be decisive for the future of the ceasefire. More on that in just a moment, but before we dive in, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. In the event of a ceasefire, Ukraine might not get justice for the losses it suffered as a result of Russian aggression. The Polish economy cements its position as the fastest-growing economy in Central and Eastern Europe. And the Ukrainian ambassador to Poland criticized Ukrainians displaying nationalist symbols at a famous Belarusian rappers show in Warsaw. U.S. President Donald Trump will aim to secure a ceasefire during his upcoming meeting with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, said French President Emmanuel Macron after multiple conferences between leaders were held in Berlin. Macron said that European leaders, together with President Volodymyr Zelensky, have convinced Trump that discussions on territorial concessions cannot happen at the upcoming Trump-Putin Alaska meeting without Ukraine's presence at the negotiating table. Kazimierz Wysiak brings us more details.
Wednesday's video conference, the last major effort to coordinate for Ukraine's Western allies before US President Donald Trump meets with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. And European leaders are cautiously optimistic after the call.
President Trump was very clear on the fact that what the United States wants is to obtain a ceasefire during this meeting in Alaska. It's very important that this happens and we support this initiative, as well as new prisoner exchanges and the liberation of Ukrainian children.
The US president previously mentioned Ukraine and Russia would likely have to swap some territory to achieve peace. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is making things abundantly clear. No such deal can be made in Alaska on Friday.
As for our principles, as for our territorial integrity, in the end it is still decided at the level of leaders. It is impossible to solve this without Ukraine, and by the way, everyone supports this.
The leaders also agreed that the next step should be a trilateral summit between the US, Russia and Ukraine.
We wish for this to be held in Europe in a neutral country that would be accepted by all parties.
President Zelensky, who attended the conference with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in Berlin, has also told President Trump that Vladimir Putin can't be trusted.
Putin is bluffing. He's trying to put pressure before the meeting in Alaska along all parts of the Ukrainian front. Russia is trying to show that it can occupy all of Ukraine.
One of the major red lines for Ukraine is to have security guarantees before making any peace agreements. That's something that the US president apparently agreed with during the meeting, although the details of these guarantees haven't been announced.
That is why I pointed out in my opening statement that we must also continue to get the Ukrainian army fit to defend the country. What security guarantees might look like and from which countries would they come was not the subject of today's talks, but this will have to follow as soon as the path to peace has been opened.
Poland also had not one but two voices at the virtual summit. First, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk spoke with the European partners and the Ukrainian president.
The first meeting, which I attended, gathered the leaders of Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Poland and Finland, and also President Zelensky. We wanted to have a single, coordinated statement from Europe for the following meeting with US President Donald Trump.
Then, in his first appearance on an international stage in his new role, Poland's President Karol Nawrocki represented the country during the call with President Trump. According to Nawrocki's top foreign policy advisor, the Polish leader wants to convince his US counterpart to keep pressuring Putin.
What we need to exert is more pressure on Russia when it comes to sanctions, when it comes also to the military support to Ukraine, because the only language which is understood by President Putin is the language of strength.
The United States was to impose secondary sanctions on Russia and its biggest economic partners last week for prolonging the war. The prospect of the meeting on Friday has put this on hold, and now all eyes are on Anchorage, Alaska. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łysiak.
As high-level diplomacy takes place in the German capital, we are hearing more about what Ukraine's expectations and demands may be in peace negotiations. Joining me to bring us more on this is our correspondent Alex Kadier in Kyiv. Good evening, Alex. So what have we heard from the Ukrainian leadership in terms of their negotiating position? And how are people in Ukraine actually viewing these talks?
Yeah, well, good evening, Claudia. We've heard 5 key points from the Ukrainian leadership, these key negotiating positions put forward by the Ukrainian side. The first is a durable ceasefire before any talks about territory, any territorial talks. We've heard Donald Trump talking about land swapping. We've also heard European leaders earlier today saying that no substantive discussions have happened about that point. No concessions on borders from the Ukrainian side, no withdrawal from the Donbass region. We were speaking in the last few days about those heavily fortified cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which would be essential to any future defense of Ukraine. That's the first point. The second, more security guarantees, a path to NATO and the EU, and sustained military aid from Ukraine's Western partners, and no forced demilitarization. That, of course, from the Ukrainian perspective, is because they fear yet another Russian invasion of their country. The third, Russian reparations. They want the Russian Federation to pay for the war of aggression that they started in this country over the last 3.5 years, and even before that, since 2014. The fourth point, of course, perhaps overlooked in a lot of these, but certainly in no way unimportant, the return of abducted children and prisoners of war. 20,000 children have been taken from Ukrainian lands, and thousands of prisoners are still held. The last point in these negotiations, no sanction relief for Russia. The maintaining and strengthening of sanctions to prevent Russia from rebuilding, regrouping, and invading. Again, that is the position from the Ukrainian leadership. We've heard also from Andriy Yermak, who's the head of the presidential office here in Ukraine. He said that Russia has long tried to pretend something could be decided without Ukraine. That will not happen. There is clear coordination between allies. The United States, Europe, and Ukraine are united in that principle. So a little bit of a defiance there from the head of the presidential office. But let's also bring it to Ukrainians that I've been speaking to in the last few days. Really, the sense there is we'll believe it when we see it. There is not a lot of expectation, not a lot of hope in these talks, in that meeting in Alaska. A lot of soldiers and military officers that I've been speaking to say they are ready to continue the fight, ready to go it alone. People in this country want peace, but not peace at any cost. Claudia.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was Alex Kadier reporting live from Kyiv. Ukraine has collected a sizable amount of evidence should it ever want to bring Russia to justice for war crimes, experts have told TVP World. This could happen even in the instance of a ceasefire, but is there enough political will, particularly in the U.S., to hold Putin to account through these legal mechanisms? Angela Skujins reports.
In 2023, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. The then president of the Hague Court clarified the warrant was in relation to the unlawful deportation of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to Russia.
It is forbidden by international law for occupied powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories. Children enjoy special protection under the Geneva Convention.
While some of these children have been returned to their families, Ukraine claims more than 19,500 children have been abducted by the Kremlin. Kyiv says these abductions are war crimes that meet the UN treaty definition of genocide. Since then, the ICC has issued arrest warrants for Russian military commanders Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov. They have been charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes over missile strikes against civilian targets such as power plants. The Kremlin has rejected the ICC's child abduction allegations, as well as the claims against its senior officials. But with a potential ceasefire on the table orchestrated by US President Donald Trump and taking place in Alaska on Friday, many are wondering what will happen to these files. TVP World asked University of Oxford law expert Philippa Webb for a state of play at the ICC if a truce were to occur.
In international law, it is clearly established that there is no amnesty for crimes against humanity or war crimes or genocide. So these most serious crimes cannot be forgiven through a political process.
Due to the gravity of the crimes and volume of evidence, Webb said she would be surprised if the ICC investigations were suspended. But TVP World's Marcin Zaborowski believes there is not enough political will to pursue these cases, particularly against Putin, as the major heavy hitters, such as the US and China, have remained silent. And because there are no plans for Putin to travel to the ICC in the Netherlands.
Something could only happen if you had a revolution in Russia and Vladimir Putin is imprisoned. And new Russia is willing to hand over Vladimir Putin to The Hague.
Angela Skujins for TVP World.
This is a great day for Poland for the security of the Polish state, said Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz as he signed a major $3.8 billion deal to give the Polish F-16s an upgrade after years of use. The investment marks another step towards boosting Poland's defense capabilities amid the push to reach the 5% of GDP spending target for NATO members. Natalia Komarow has more on the importance of this move by the Polish government.
Poland is set to modernize its fleet of F-16 fighter jets, as Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz signed a $3.8 billion contract at the Military Aviation Works in Bydgoszcz.
This is a great day for Poland, for the security of the Polish state.
48 F-16s, named Hawk by the Polish Air Force, arrived in the country between 2006 and 2008. After almost 20 years in service, it's now high time for their midlife upgrade, which will significantly prolong their service lives. The modernization effort will be carried out domestically. Earlier this week, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk visited another defense factory in Bydgoszcz, Nitrohem, which manufactures TNT and other explosives.
We would like most of our defense production to take place in Poland. We would like to own the products and licenses that our security depends on.
Experts note that for too long, Poland relied on foreign arms manufacturers, despite having its own defense industry.
Plants in Poland don't produce much, but for many years that production wasn't expected. These companies merely aimed to survive, to stay on the market. The key thing is that something has changed, that big investment projects are now in the works. But to see the fruit of these investments, we still have to wait a few years.
Poland has been leading both NATO and EU defense spending charts, reaching 4.7% of GDP in 2025. But in the region, efforts to enhance and modernize the military are pretty much universal. Romania is pushing to spend on defense despite dealing with a significant budget deficit, aiming, for example, to expand its F-16s fleet from 33 to 49 aircraft by the end of the year. To that end, Bucharest applied for European defense funds.
It's a good loan with a repayment period of over 40 years and a grace period of 10 years, so that Romania can shore up its military capabilities in the coming years without having to strain the national budget.
The Czech Republic has recently signed a $292 million contract with Germany's Rheinmetall to bring the maintenance and servicing of Leopard tanks home. It was yet another move aimed at aligning the Czech army with NATO standards. Central and Eastern Europe is racing to rebuild its army capabilities amid growing threats from Russia, a country which has put its entire economy on a war footing, spending close to 7% of GDP on its military.
Money doesn't win wars, money allows to build defense capabilities. NATO as a whole nominally spends more than Russia, even now that Moscow allocates so much of its budget on arms. We spend enough to boost our defense, but also still develop economically.
This coming Friday, the Polish Armed Forces annual military parade will take place in Warsaw, where Poles will get the chance to see their army's latest acquisitions. For TVP World, Natalia Komarow.
It is the state's responsibility to act effectively and serve justice when such incidents occur, regardless of whether they involve Ukrainians, Belarusians, Germans. It does not matter, said Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk in connection to deportation proceedings open against 57 Ukrainians and 6 Belarusians responsible for orchestrating scuffles and displaying nationalist symbols at the Warsaw performance of a famous Belarusian rapper. Anastasia Yanchenko has an update on this developing story.
57 Ukrainians and 6 Belarusians must leave Poland. This decision was announced by the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
It is the state's responsibility to act effectively and serve justice when such incidents occur, regardless of whether they involve Ukrainians or Belarusians, Germans. It does not matter. Polish law must be upheld.
This is the aftermath of violent incidents, clashes with law enforcement and security personnel, and unsanctioned gatherings the day before and during the performance of Belarusian rapper Max Korsh in Warsaw. In consequence, hundreds were detained and presented with a range of charges, including drug possession, assaulting security personnel, using unsanctioned pyrotechnics and trespassing. In the crowd, flags of the Ukrainian insurgent army, linked in Poland to World War II-era killings of Poles, were also spotted.
This kind of symbols is often associated with fascism and genocide.
The scandal sparked strong reactions not only online, but also drawing the attention of newly elected President Karol Nawrocki. He stressed the need for the Polish government to classify the Ukrainian insurgent army flag as an extremist symbol, which could lead to harsher legal consequences.
This needs to happen in Poland. And naturally, Banderite symbols in Polish and Ukrainian public spaces are an outrage to me.
Although there has been no reaction from Ukraine's top leadership, the Ukrainian ambassador to Poland, Vasyl Bodnar, condemned the actions of those who broke the law.
Such behaviors are blatantly disrespectful toward Poland. We live here as guests, so we cannot violate established traditions or create precedents that will cast a shadow on all Ukrainian citizens living here. I want to remind everyone that millions of Ukrainians live and work here, law-abiding citizens who follow all the rules and norms of the host country and, for the most part, add value to Polish society.
According to the latest estimates, more than 1.5 million Ukrainians live in Poland, about 1 million of whom arrived after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Max Korsh, a Belarusian rapper and top streaming artist, drew over 60,000 fans with his performance in Warsaw, mostly hailing from Ukraine and Belarus. However, his Russian-language songs sparked controversy within the Ukrainian diaspora, dividing it between Ukrainian and Russian speakers.
I really don't understand why Ukrainians went to that stadium. The performance was in Russian, and those who speak that language are now killing Ukrainians, waging war and destroying Ukraine. The negative reaction of some Ukrainians is understandable, as we are at war with Russia, which is killing us. The performer, who may not support the war himself, still performs under a Russian label that continues to operate in Russia, possibly paying taxes that help sustain the Russian war machine against us.
This report for TVP World by Anastasia Yanchenko.
Poland's economy is gaining momentum. New data shows GDP growth has accelerated in the second quarter of this year, solidifying the country's position as the fastest growing economy in Central and Eastern Europe and one of the fastest growing in Europe. Konrad Gorlinski brings us this next report.
Poland's Central Statistical Office released its first second quarter GDP estimates on Wednesday, and the numbers did not disappoint.
So this 3.4% we can see means acceleration from the first quarter. In the first quarter we saw 3.2, now it is 3.4. And it proves the point that economic growth in Poland is slightly quickening.
Second quarter GDP grew 3.4% year-on-year, 0.2 points above the previous quarter, fueling expectations of faster momentum in the second half of the year. Full details on the growth drivers will be available in September, but analysts already point to two main forces: resilient household consumption and the surge in fixed investment, boosted mainly by EU recovery funds frozen under the previous government.
Investment is becoming this second engine of economic growth in Poland, and it significantly supports private consumption, which traditionally is strong in Poland.
Poland's results outpaced all of Europe outside of Ireland and certainly all of its peers in the Central Eastern Europe region. The Czech Republic posted 2.4% growth in the second quarter, while Hungary balances at recession's edge with 0.2%. Slovakia and Romania haven't reported their numbers yet, with the economy expanding at 1.2% in the former and contracting by 1.8% in the latter. The momentum is set to build as public investments financed with recovery money flow deeper into the economy, with analysts projecting their pace to rise by up to 11% in real terms by the fourth quarter. The Polish Finance Ministry projects GDP growth at 3.7% in 2025, but many analysts see that as rather conservative.
In Bank PKO, we still hold to our forecast of 4.0 economic growth.
One potential wildcard, Friday's meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Could a Ukraine deal push these projections even higher?
If assuming that there are good news about Ukraine, then it may lead to the improvement of the mood in Poland and to the acceleration of the investment, and most likely over a longer period of time to the acceleration of exports as well.
Most analysts agree, however, that a breakthrough in Ukraine would be visible in Polish financial markets almost immediately. But unfortunately, the spillover into the broader economy could take at least until late next year.
President Trump was very clear that the United States wanted to achieve a ceasefire at this meeting in Alaska, said French President Emmanuel Macron following a video call earlier on Wednesday. U.S. President Donald Trump also said Ukraine must be involved in the talks about territory in any ceasefire deal with Russia. How are today's talks between Europe, Ukraine and the U.S. going to change the trajectory of the Friday meeting between Trump and Putin? Mark Toth, U.S. national security and foreign policy analyst, joins me now to discuss what changed after these officials spoke. Good evening, and thank you for joining.
Good evening. Thank you for having me back on TVP World.
Always a pleasure. So recently, President Trump said that he is somewhat annoyed by President Zelensky's behavior. Do you think that this changed after the talk they had today?
Hopefully so, because look, there are certain constraints that Zelensky has in terms of the Rada and what is rightly, the Ukrainian parliament, what is rightly their domain, and any kind of territorial concessions would have to come from them. It's not something that Zelensky himself can do by edict, and hopefully he conveyed that to Trump, that he doesn't have this power that Trump seems to think he does, that he can just divvy up in some kind of land swap with Putin and come to some type of deal in terms of a long-term solution or peace deal. What really needs to be the focus here is the ceasefire, and hopefully that's what Zelensky was able to convey, along with NATO partners in discussion with Trump in those conversations that happened earlier.
During today's call, we know that Mr. Zelensky said what security guarantees might look like and from which countries was not the subject of today's talks, but this will have to follow as soon as the path to peace has been opened. However, we did hear from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, we did hear from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and they did mention the security guarantees. What do you think those security guarantees could possibly look like?
Right. It's important, I think, for them to be as robust as possible. You have to have U.S. participation in it. And the Kiev Post, and full disclosure, a paper that I also write for, is reporting that in that discussions with Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, that he had with Zelensky earlier, that was one of the parameters that Trump had expressed willingness, allegedly, in this call, that there would be U.S. participation. So whether that's just logistical support, intelligence support, satellite overview, et cetera, that's a critical component. I think to get to the heart of your question, what also needs to happen is you do need NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine in a post-war environment. Now, maybe they don't have to be wearing the NATO badge because that might be an issue with the Russians, but there certainly needs to be Polish troops there, British troops there, French troops there to enforce this so that Putin at some point in the future doesn't decide, as many of us fear, and frankly predict that he would, simply start this war up again. So That has to happen. And then air defenses. In terms of the security guarantees, I think you have to have an active defense that's pushed forward to make sure that there's not skirmishes that happen in some kind of post-war or post-ceasefire environment. Those are ideals, but we're not close yet in terms of getting there.
Mm-hmm. Which takes me to my next question. How long do you think it would actually take all of us to get to a point where there is a ceasefire agreement? Because we know that in terms of past conflicts that we've seen, there's been a certain timeline that has to be fulfilled before something is actually set in stone and put on paper. How long for this conflict do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to get into the prediction game. It's a fair question. Many of us are wondering. I think it's probably better, though, to step back and look at how far apart the two sides are. At this point, the Russian Foreign Ministry, yet again today, is still setting out maximalist conditions. They're claiming, for instance, that they're not willing to withdraw from Kherson, from Zaporizhia, or from any part of the Donetsk, claiming that these referendums they had and the incorporation into Russia itself means that they're constitutionally now protected and enshrined in Russia, and that they can't give that up. So that's maximalist. They're not willing to yield to anything. They still want it all. And if viewers will remember, it's not that they just annexed those territories that they control, those portions of those territories that they control. They annexed all of them, including parts that Ukraine still controls. And obviously, Ukraine is not going to give up land that's sovereign and be still under the control of their military. So I really think the two sides are far off. If you look at the statement that was put out by Friedrich Merz and by Volodymyr Zelensky today, it made it clear as well that, look, this first step needs to be ceasefire focused, and with the conditions being that Ukraine still has to have the right to join NATO, that it's not going to withdraw from the Donbas. That's something else that Putin wants very much. But if Ukraine were to do that, it would be, in effect, military suicide, because they'd be giving up their key fortress belt that's really stopped Putin from making sweeping gains. So I don't think we're anywhere close to kind of put a bow on your question, just because the two sides at this point are still talking maximalist. Never say never. There could be breakthroughs at this point. But at this point, if we listen to the words that each side is saying, they're still very, very far apart.
Mm-hmm. It is widely understood in the West that the security of Ukraine also equals security of Europe. And as we've heard from Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Russia may use ceasefire to build up and strike again. Also, we've heard from Mr. Zelensky, who said Putin is bluffing. He's trying to put pressure before the meeting in Alaska. How do we stop that from happening? What has to happen during that meeting? What borders, what boundaries have to be laid down for that not to take place?
Right. What Friedrich Merz did today by meeting with Zelensky and laying these out, the statements by your own Prime Minister Donald Tusk saying the same thing, I think is an important first step. Because what you can't have is a U.S. president saying, look, Europe needs to up its defense spending, get it to 5% GDP, and claim that the reason you need to do that is because of a future Russian threat, right? And Trump has done all of that. He's acknowledged that Russia represents a threat, not just to Eastern Europe, but to all of Europe. But you can't do that and then turn around and then in Alaska, come Friday, have Trump negotiate on behalf of all of Europe. You need your own red lines. And those red lines have to be a complete understanding that Putin cannot be allowed to win in Ukraine. Any kind of peace settlement that comes about, and initially a ceasefire, cannot make concessions that would put Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, the Suwalki Gap, the Baltic states, and now Finland, that it's now part of NATO, any of those countries at risk. And certainly, out there, kind of as a tangent, Moldova as well. So, those are all things that Europe has to say, look, the keystone to protecting all of that and stopping this war from going further west and reaching into Poland, into Berlin, into Brussels, et cetera, it all depends on making sure that Ukraine doesn't lose. So in my mind, before Friday, it's got to be very clear from our NATO allies that, look, these are red lines for us. We're not going to allow some kind of grand land swap that results in an advantageous military position for Putin at the expense of Europe's long-term security. And let me be very clear here, just quickly, Europe's security would be very much at risk if that comes about. Ukraine needs to win. Ukraine needs to remain independent. Ukraine needs to be part of NATO to protect Eastern Europe in the long run.
Our time is coming to an end, but very shortly, last but not least, trilateral summit. We've heard from President Macron. We know that there is that plan. When would it happen? What do you think?
Yeah, it should have happened as the first step. I think Trump made a huge mistake here backing off of it. He's trying to hide behind that it was Putin that extended the invitation to meet. And so hopefully, there's discussion yet today that Trump is pushing for it. I think Trump and Zelensky would be perfectly happy to do it. I suspect that if it's agreed to, you'll see that Putin, one way or the other, backs out of it. But time will tell. But it should happen as fast as possible because Ukraine should be there at the table. And frankly, real quickly here, so should the rest of Europe. This is everyone's long-term fight here. And you all need seats at the table. Just cannot be Trump doing it.
Thank you so much. Mark Toth, U.S. National Security and Foreign Policy Analyst, was my guest.
Right.
Thank you. And so this would be all for now, but please do tune in tomorrow for another edition of World News Tonight at 8 p.m. CET. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and we're going to see you there.